turnout. I'm so happy to see everybody here today. Our panel of discussion today is What is Woke and Are You It? A panel discussion on racial bias through historic, institutionalized, and lived perspectives. Hi, come on in. Yeah, grab a chair, any open chair. Welcome. So, let's see. So there are a few reasons why this came about and a few reasons why I am one of the hosts of this event. So the Alumni Office is co-hosting this with Living in Color and the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. Hello, welcome. And as well as the events committee. So it's been really, really cool to have so many different parts of campus come together to support this event. And, you know, several things lined up. One, Black History Month. I think, you know, in a lot of ways there was a hope to produce some content around that, raise awareness, things that would inspire conversation. Also, there was an awkward and in many ways awful exchange on one of the social media platforms between a student and a couple of alums. You know, I think in a lot of ways, hi, welcome. There are a couple spots still in the back, shooting around the side. It really daylighted a lot of different things and a lot of different feelings for people, and I think the biggest takeaway for me, other than having, you know, KJ and Ricardo come and talk to me about it in a way that was about starting a conversation instead of like, you know, all of your alumni are awful people. You know, it was really great for them to come at it from just a very, very different perspective of like, all right, you know, clearly a conversation needs to be had. But the other thing from sort of looking through the stream was that several of the people who chimed in were people that were my cohorts here at Marlboro. And I realized that some of them were sort of frozen in time in their ideas around discussions on race and racial bias and racism, and what they were contributing to the conversation for them was, you know, what they thought was sort of the latest in thinking around it. And as we sort of started to talk through the problem, quickly we were all in agreement that this is a moving target, and it's something that is evolving every day around us and through us. And, you know, we can either choose to engage and do better, or we can put our heads back in the sand, which helps no one. So we're really, really fortunate today to have 3 panelists with us. So I'm just going to read a little bit. Shanta Lee Gander is an artist and multifaceted professional. As an artist, her endeavors include writing, prose, poetry, investigative journalism, and photography. Her writing has been featured in Rebel Society and the Ms. Blog. She also writes frequently for the Commons newspaper. Come on in. I think we've got some C's over there. She's a former select person on the Marlboro Town Select Board. Brattleboro, sorry. Yeah, no, thank you. She's currently the Director of Outreach and Publicity at Mount Island, a small press and magazine dedicated to rural LGBTQ+ and people of color voices and artists. I said rural. And gives lectures on the life of Lucy Terry Prince, who we'll learn more about, as a member of the Vermont Council on the Humanities Speaker Bureau. She's an MFA candidate at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she's conducting research and interviews among scholars, poets, and writers on a project that is Lost, Forgotten, and Stolen, the Transference of Memory of Our Ancestors, Our Past, and Literary Epigenetics. Did I do it? Yay. Specifically as it relates to African Americans and African diaspora. Jenna Chandler-Ward, right here to my right, is an 1992. She is a founder and co-director of the Multicultural Teaching Institute, which produces workshops and conferences for educators on issues of equity and inclusion, and a co-founder of the organization Teaching While White. In an interview with Boston Voyager magazine, she said, "Teaching While White is trying to explore all the different ways that whiteness is going unnamed, because there can be no true discussion on progress without acknowledging the impact that race plays on education." Her plan of concentration here was theater that provokes social change, a study of theater and sociology. Hi, we need more chairs. And it was considering the problems of homeless women's relation to gender issues in contemporary American society. And she studied with Paul Nelson, Jerry Levy, and Jeffrey Brown. Julie Pham, PhD, gets our long distance award coming from Seattle, where she is currently. Hi, welcome. Feel free to grab a spot on the floor or chairs next door, however more comfortable. VP of Community Engagement. Hi, welcome. Grab a spot anywhere. At Washington Technology Industry Association. She's an author, a contributor to Forbes magazine, focusing on stories about businesses owned by people of color. She is the former editor of Northwest Vietnamese News, which was founded by her parents. She's a recipient of the 2010 New America Media Atlantic Philanthropies Ethnic Elders Journalism Fellowship, and co-founder of CDs, which is a capacity building program for Seattle's ethnic media. She earned her PhD in history at Cambridge University as a Gates Scholar, and she says, "I look at this work as a recovering academic, someone who enjoys, come on in, anywhere you're comfortable. Someone who enjoys the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of curiosity, while also being able to think about having hard conversations and how they apply to real world situations and work situations." So I'll just quickly talk about what our format's going to be today and explain the index cards that you have, and yes, you get to keep the pen, souvenir. So each of our panelists are going to speak about ethnic bias and racism, sort of from the perspectives of their areas of expertise. So Shanta is going to speak from mostly a historic perspective. Jenna is going to speak from more of an institutionalized perspective, and Julie is going to speak more to kind of a boots on the ground, today, lived perspective. And so they'll each speak for about 15 minutes, and then after that we'll have a chance to kind of open up the discussion amongst them, amongst all of us. And where the cards come in is if you have questions that are sparked during all of this going on, feel free to knock those down on the cards. And one of the reasons why folks agreed on using the cards was so that you can be comfortable to ask any question that you want. And yeah, we go until 3:30, and I think we're ready to rock.
I'm very honored actually to be sharing this panel with both of you. So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm gonna back away from the word expertise, because the more that I discover and learn is the more that I know that I don't know shit. So I'm a lifelong student in all areas. So when we look at the history of race in Vermont, it's very nuanced. And one of the theories I've been thinking about for a while is thinking about how if we reverse engineer back and look at a place and look at how it started and look at some of the mythologies, current mythologies and actions, most likely we can find some of the roots that have bloomed historically and kind of held root there. So when Vermonters or individuals who've come here over time like to talk about Vermont being a liberal state, I do believe they're channeling a couple of things. Channeling the 1786 law, which upon further exploration has it banned slavery, but when you take a look at the landscape and look at the nuance, it was more of a gesture rather than something that was actually stitched to other parts of fabric in the landscape during the time. So also, I'd like to point people to definitely read Dr. Harvey Imani's Whitfield's book. He's a UVM professor. He wrote The Problem of Slavery in Early Vermont, 1777 through 1810. And also the Vermont Humanities Council had a podcast, Before Your Time, that also looked at this topic of deconstructing some of the mythologies around, you know, us being a liberal state and what the roots were in Vermont. When I use the term gesture here, I'm using it on purpose for a couple of reasons. One, I'm relating things to like putting up a Black Lives Matter sign up, but there's nothing else stitched into the welcome. Like you threw up a sign and that was pretty much it. I'm also echoing something that a Marlboro student once told me a few years ago of coming from another place and seeing the signs, but not really feeling the welcome. Which is, so in this way, I feel like laws and policies sometimes can be just a gesture that can often fall very empty. So in 1786, the Vermont legislature stated, the idea of slavery is expressly and totally exploded from our free government. Now again, the picture was way more complicated. So Dr. Whitfield talks about how messy the process was. So 1777, Vermont likes to brag about being the first state in its constitution to outlaw slavery, but it outlawed adult slavery. If you look closely at the language, you'll find not only is the language is flimsy, but you'll also ask the question, well, if it's outlawing adult slavery, well, what does that mean for enslaving children, for example? Or if you think about the landscape and think about the fact that there were no anti-slavery societies until the 1830s in Vermont, and what that means, they play a key role because even though we don't think about it today, they helped to keep African Americans who were free persons free, keep them free and safe from re-enslavement. So what this means is even though we have this law in the book and even though we have this recognized in the Constitution, we have the African Americans who are here in early Vermont very vulnerable still. We have a situation like a case that involved a slave who belonged to a judge, a Vermont Supreme Court judge named Stephen Jacob. And there was a suit brought against him. But the irony of all of it is the suit wasn't brought against him because people were concerned for Dinah's well-being or for the fact that he was breaking the law. What happened is he discarded Dinah at the age of 47. So she'd become ill. She could no longer be his slave and do the duties that he needed her to do. He discarded her, and so she was relying on public charity. She became a burden. So the select people of Windsor they brought a suit. They wanted reimbursement for everything they incurred for taking care of Dinah publicly. And they also wanted to bring forth his bill of sale. They wanted to illustrate that Dinah did indeed belong to Judge Jacob. However, his peers did not want to admit that he had been involved with something illegal. They did not allow the bill of sale to come forth. A closer look will reveal that slave owners could take respite in the state of Vermont during that time, still participate in slavery, still participate in something that was technically against law, but then how was the law going to intervene in that? Also, when I've looked at other sources and read other things, you'll have cases, if you look at old letters, people who lived in the north and did own slave plantations in the south. So they're actually managing their slave plantations back and forth, but still living here in the north as if. Again, it's all about looking at the nuance. You also have cases in which, in 1789, the Bennington Friendly Society was having a debate. Was it the moral responsibility and obligation of Vermonters to help aid individuals who were fighting for their freedom through their escape? Should they aid in that, or should they return those individuals back to their masters? 6 individuals voted and felt that it was a moral obligation to help these individuals. 5 individuals disagreed with that. So again, you have a landscape in which, people are debating whether or not they should be participating, in what ways should they be participating or not participating in this larger institution of slavery. In 1786, in the Vermont Gazette, there was a fugitive slave ad, and Dr. Whitman raises the question that there must have been some kind of audience for this ad in order for this kind of ad to run. When you revisit all the moments of nuance and then take a further step back in American history, you also know that when slavery was abolished here, across America, allegedly, you also know, you'll learn that there were states that tried to put things in place. They would cloak it in apprenticeship or work programs so that they could keep younger people still enslaved and still hold on to their labor. You also had incidences of slave masters running away with groups of slaves and continuing to keep them enslaved. So again, we want to step back and look at the unzipping of what does this all mean today. And so here are some of the questions I'd like to pose when we think about diversity, inclusion, and equity in terms of its practice and daily use here. So when we look at history, we should definitely also do the reverse engineering, look at a current landscape, see where some of the gaps are, and also question where some of the gaps are historically as well. There are a lot of historians, like I am forgetting her name, so forgive me. There's a book called They Were Her Property that actually deconstructs basically white women as slave owners. They played a healthy role. But also questioning some of the historians that helped to repeat some of the mythologies of women also being property of their husbands, so therefore they didn't play a big role, right? No, some of these women actually took their husbands to court so that they could keep their property separate. So again, deconstructing and asking those questions of who and what is missing. Also, in what ways are we needing to match gesture, like when we raise flags or put up signs, with the real opportunities for every day? So for example, if someone, you put up a Black Matter sign and you see it in different places and you have different events that, again, it's not stitched really into the fabric, but you're having these moments, right? But you walk into a grocery store or you go into Walgreens and you don't see offerings that make you feel really welcome. I can't tell you how many times I've had hair products shipped over state lines, and I know there are other people like me, or people, it's almost like we've created a network where people are whispering to me saying, well, when my hair is done, they'll say, well, where'd you get your hair done? Oh, I figured you went to New York. Things like that. So how do we create a space of welcome? There's so many personal examples I have of this. The most glaring moments are what I call missed opportunities. Individuals not looking closely at their policies or their actions. How do they continue to play a role in exclusion? So for example, and I've seen this happen so many times I've lost count. People are, and I'm thinking with like my MBA hat on, so people are looking at their strategic plans or their 5-year plans, and they treat it like plug and play. They take it off the shelf, they dust it off, and they're putting in play the same thing that they've been doing, but yet they want the different results, right? So again, we have to think about that. I've lost count of how many conversations I've had where I leave feeling like I'm the crazy person. I have to do mental calculus where I'm thinking, okay, is this person being ageist, racist, or do we have a combination of both here? And I'm like doing it, and it's a mental workout. Of advice that I never asked for. I get helped more times than I just don't want it. And it's a very interesting thing when it happens. But also, there are many moments where I've noticed individuals they're not paying proper attention to their optics. So this one is funny, not so funny example. When I was on the Brattleboro Select Board, there's a moment when there's public comment. So individuals get to actually come forth, there's a microphone, and talk about their suggestions or whatever is ailing them, right? So we're all there listening. And in this one instance, this was a few years ago, an individual, they're in the process of talking about a certain parking garage that we have in Brattleboro, how to make it more of a community space. And so her suggestions included things like piping through music and, hanging up some art and all of that, popcorn, that was all fine. But then she got to the suggestion about having shoe shiners. Now, I'm glad they didn't have the camera on because I just literally went, shoe shiners. And then I noticed some of the brown people in the audience were just like, brows are creasing, heads are shaking. She couldn't see it because she's at the front. She was like, thinking, yeah, we could have shoe shiners. Now, one of my peers on the select board, who's an older white gentleman, said, when I was a kid, that was an opportunity for a job, that was a possibility. And I told him very clearly that as a woman of color, that translates differently, that reads very differently, like hashtag don't do that, right? So, and also not only to mention, now this is the funny part, like in Brattleboro, and if you know anything about Brattleboro and you've been there in the summer, shoes are optional for some people. So you're not gonna, goodbye to the shoe shining, right? So I've lived in Vermont for about 10 years. This state was not my choice at all. It just kind of sort of happened as things in life do. And one of the problems here that I've noticed and thinking about is that sometimes I feel like people are trying so hard that it makes them blind to the everyday opportunities that they really could be engaging in, to be inclusive or to just be real or to kind of open the doors to welcome. Also, when we have events that are just specifically within Black History Month or specifically within certain moments, but not stitched into the rest of the fabric of the community, then you have a problem. And I'll keep this G-rated because there's an example that I use that I'm not sure people would appreciate. But I will just say people want all the benefits of diversity without doing the work. You want to pull up, you want to be able to check a box, you want to be able to invite some brown faces or people of different sexualities and genders to your table, and you don't want to give them a real voice. You just want to be able to say for your grant money or whatnot and say, well, we have these people around the table, isn't this nice? Look at the photo op. That doesn't work. That's not going to work. So we also must think about the stories and the mythologies we tell ourselves. What are the myths that we insist on repeating, and how do we all collude in the myth making? So as I wrap up, I would like to echo my talk with Curtis Reed Jr. He's the executive director of Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. And it was about community. And this is a question I'd like to pose to anyone in the position of creating and implementing policy, engaging in community organizing, anyone at the helm of any business, any organization. Certainly this also applies to college campuses because college campuses are communities within communities. Who do we mean and what do we mean when we say community? Because people don't think about it. They'll think that there's a community automatically just by default because we're all there, we're all hanging out in the same space. But that's not community. And sometimes you have to do things that require stepping back and revisiting how you need to shift things. Think closer about your optics, and even the most well-intentioned people I've talked to. So many examples where you have to say, don't do that. That's not gonna look good. I have to warn you, the optics are really bad on that, and you might wanna do it in this way. And so again, who and what do we mean by community? And then if there are some gaps in that, how do we get there? It's not gonna be perfect. I'm not saying we all wanna sing Kumbaya with each other. I'm certainly not interested in that. Just for anybody who knows me, I like to be in the corner writing, or in the middle of some woods writing and doing something off on my own. But I think that we need to be very honest with ourselves about this picture and the landscape. And again, think about the stories we keep repeating and telling ourselves. And so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know much about Vermont, and now I feel like I've learned so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna. I'm an alum, and I need to acknowledge that I'm having way more emotions than I thought I would, just being here and being part of this today. So I just wanted to say that I'm walking into the room holding that a little bit. So I'm excited to be here. I did my plan on theater that provokes social change. I had a Marlboro sticker on my car, and every once in a while people will beep and I'll be in some random city and they'll roll down their window, "What was your plan in?" And then I'll say, "What was yours?" And one guy said, "I don't remember, but I love Marlboro." And so it's that badge. And I actually am one of the few people, at one point somebody said we should, I'm one of the few people, I actually did work with homeless people for a long time after I graduated, so my plan actually did directly lead me into a path. I was a professional actor for a long time. Ultimately, I became an educator, and that is where the work that I do now stemmed from. I was a classroom teacher in lots of different places and working in nonprofits and public schools, independent schools, universities, and for a bunch of different reasons. I originally grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and was sent to one of the last schools in the country to desegregate. And in fact, they chose to shut down rather than desegregate. I'm 50 years old, just for perspective. And my parents chose to send me there when it reopened, and I was one of 4 white students. The rest were all black, but all of the teachers were white. And now that we know what's going on in Charlottesville currently, this sort of speaks to a broader perspective. But in that era, it was considered racist to talk about race. In a lot of spaces, that is still the case. And so though I was walking into this incredibly racially charged, I mean, we were taught cotton picking songs in my music class. We had a book called The Happy Slave. But I would go home to my white, racially segregated neighborhood. My parents were ministers. Our church was almost entirely white, and there was no discussion about what I was engaging in on a daily basis. And it wasn't until much later in my life that I started to unpack some of these things. And what I came to see is that when we talk about race in education, usually what that means is scrutinizing the faculty, the students, the families of color, to talk about the ways that we can help people do better within education. And very rarely is there a discussion of whiteness and how whiteness is part of education. And in fact, most schools were created for and by white people. It is used, the culture of whiteness is the baseline from which everything is judged. We have a school to prison pipeline, and we don't talk about how the system is failing. We talk about how those kids are failing. We talk about achievement gaps. We don't talk about expectation and opportunity gaps. In fact, whiteness really goes invisible most of the time. And so through a very circuitous route, I ended up really wanting to dig into whiteness and what does that mean, and why aren't we talking about it, and what is it, and how is it playing out in our schools. And 84% of our teachers in this country are white. Closer to 90% of administrators in this country are white. Textbook writers, teacher educators, and how is whiteness being replicated and invisible and unnamed, and how is it impacting our country? And so through that, I'm not an expert, and the more I know, the more I don't know. But I spend my days now working with teachers across the country, mostly doing professional development, mostly just white teachers. If I work with multiracial faculty, I always have a co-presenter of color, so I'm not here to speak about racism. I can only speak about whiteness. And I also, through this work, have we've developed a podcast, my partner and I, and a blog series. We want to know, what are teachers doing to make whiteness explicit? What are best practices? Who's doing something? What can we learn? How do we shine a bigger light so that everybody can sort of see that it's there, just even to begin with? So we have a podcast, we have a blog series, educators from around the country contribute. And part of that work is that we try to center student voice. And so I also interview students all around the country, some as old as 6 or 7 years old. They volunteer to be interviewed. We don't surprise them, like, surprise, we're here to talk about race. They know what they're signing up for, right? They know we change everyone's name who's under 18, unless they want to keep their name. So it's anonymous. They know what they've signed up for. And what I see again and again is just the amount of racial stress and breakdown of children, white children primarily, when they are faced with talking about race. And this is what keeps me awake at night, because I think we have successfully raised the next generation of white people who are afraid to talk about race, who don't have the vocabulary, who don't have any framework, who have no scaffolding, no understanding. I know that racism is, part of its requirement is to keep people in racial isolation, and that's breaking down more and more. And yet, there are institutions, there are neighborhoods that are almost entirely white, where folks never have to bump into difference to see that maybe not everybody's having the same experience. And so we have adults who are afraid to talk about race, who are afraid to talk to their students, their own children about race, and it just continues on and on. And if we don't have white people at the table to have the discussion, nothing can change, right? Women couldn't give themselves the right to vote. It took men actually having to be involved in the solution, right? And so far, the number of white people who feel able and who show up and come to the table are so few and far between. And so that really is the mission of our work, is to bring more white people to the conversation, to educate themselves, to stop relying on folks of color to be the ones to let us know what we're doing, and to do some digging in and unpacking that we have a race as well, that our race has impacted our lives as white people, and starting to unpack some of that in order to show up for the next generation. So that is my work.
When you've been in a room and someone cracks a joke and everyone laughs and you pretend to laugh even though you didn't actually understand the joke. Raise your hand if that's happened to you. So why didn't you ask? Any answers? Why didn't you say, hey, I didn't understand the joke? Yeah.
I was scared to.
Yeah.
I was scared to ask.
Why were you scared?
I didn't want to admit that I didn't know anything.
Right. Any other answers? Yes. You didn't think it was relevant, or?
Yeah, like I really need to know, so like I didn't have to inquire, like we were just moving on with the conversation. So it was like a laugh and
Because you're like, this is not, the joke's not the purpose, I'm gonna continue. Scared, wanna make sure the conversation keeps going, anything else? Yes?
Wanting to fit in.
Want to fit in. So I think this happens a lot, where we hear something and we don't quite understand and we don't want to ask. So I think that's, for whatever, scared, want to keep that conversation moving, want to fit in, don't want to stick out. And this is actually really dangerous, because this creates this silence where, oh, I thought that was good enough. I didn't slow down the conversation. And, oh, we're a few steps down and we're having another kind of conversation, but people thought I agreed because I actually engaged at that earlier point in the way that they expected me to. And I come from a place of, I think about curiosity a lot in my work. And there are 3 experiences that I had that really kind of remind you to always think about curiosity. I've been a foreigner 3 times in my life. So the first is when I moved from Washington State to California to do my college, to do my undergrad at Berkeley. And I was like, all these Californians, because Berkeley's a state school, so it's 90% Californians. They just think California is just the best state. I don't get it. And then after a semester, I'm like, yeah, California kind of rocks. I into that. And I also remember there was this, at the top of the hill, there was something called the I House, the International House. And that's where all the international students went. I was like, oh, they're kind of weird. They're like the international students. They hang out with each other. So then I went to the UK for grad school. And I realized then, I'm one of the international students, right? And these Brits don't want to hang out and become friends with me. And so that's why all the international students hang out with each other. And then there's some things I had to learn. So, and in a way, it actually helped me understand how American I am. So, walking into a room, you're talking about feeling not included, no one would make eye contact with me. But that's because they don't make eye contact with each other. It wasn't just me, they just don't make eye contact. And the third time I felt like a foreigner was when I moved to Vietnam. And so even though I was born in Vietnam, I left when I was 2 months old. My family came as boat people to the US. I felt like I was a foreigner. I learned Vietnamese as an adult when I was 21 years old. And I knew enough to kind of get around, but I definitely had this horrible American accent, and I still have quite a bit of an accent when I speak Vietnamese. And it was exhausting the first year I lived there because Vietnamese, this was in 2002, they couldn't quite understand, well, you're Vietnamese, why don't you speak Vietnamese? And there were days where I just I wanted to pass, and I actually thought about what it must have been like to be someone who was mixed race and who could pass as white. And there are times where I just want to pass as Vietnamese. I don't want to be a foreigner, right? And so I would say very little. And I would just try to be as small as possible, because there are ways that people can recognize that I'm American. And then there were days I'd say, I'm Chinese, and so they'd be like, your Vietnamese is so good. Thank you. I needed that, right? But all of that just helped me really understand that we're all coming from different places, and that there are going to be many times where I don't understand a joke because I didn't understand that cultural reference, and does it serve me if I don't ask? Or maybe I'll ask later on so I don't slow down that conversation. But how am I going to learn if I don't ask? So I had this experience a few years ago when I was on a fellowship with a group of other students, and it was a group of mixed POC and white students. And there was a professor who used the word intersectional incorrectly. And so some of the students in my group were just really upset by this. And they were just like, I can't believe she doesn't know the word intersectional. And so then another professor heard and was just like, well, hey, I heard that you are having some challenges or concerns. Can I talk about this? And the students decided we're not going to talk to this professor. We're not going to, no issues here. We're not going to talk about it. And so one away from the professor, it's just not our job to educate. And in this, I said, I think one day we're all going to, there are going to be many things now I don't understand. And when that comes down to it, I hope that someone will explain it to me if I take the time to ask, right? And they didn't say anything. And so then the professor would come back and say, hey, let's, I really do want to understand. And again, the students said, no, we're not going to talk about this. And I said something another time, and then I just stopped saying something. And I actually became really small in that conversation. It's just like, they don't want to say anything to him. I don't want to fight this anymore. But I kept thinking, how's he going to know if we don't have this conversation? So I decided that I was going to have a separate conversation with him. And so over dinner we talked. And we talked about all of these different terms, and he asked me questions, and I asked him questions, and it was a really great conversation. And I was like, oh, do I tell the other students? Did I betray this pact if I go and tell them that I had a good conversation with this professor? And at the end of the whole experience of this fellowship, I felt like if If I were a violin, it sounded something like this, like. Right? And I fell into silence. And I've been thinking a lot about that, and it took me so much time. It took me like months, like over 6 months, digesting it with other friends. Like, what happened? I had this experience. Here I am advocating about leadership development and open conversations, and what happened? Why didn't I say anything? And someone told me in that group, because I was like crying, I was in tears, like, oh my God, full courage. And someone said, you know, Julie, I heard you. And I was nodding inside, but I didn't have the courage to say anything. And so just think about these times when someone sticks their neck out and says something, even to ask a question, because they genuinely don't understand. And then either like no one, people pretend, like, I don't hear you because I can't believe that you didn't know that, right? Or they just like, I can't believe, or they say, I can't believe you didn't know that. And where do we go from there, right? Like, and so I've been thinking a lot about there's some things that people say, like, it's not my job, it's not people of color's jobs to educate white people about race. And for me, that word education is very, it could be like one way, right? But if we're having a conversation, then that's reciprocal. And so I'm actually really, when someone asked me, hey, someone asked me once, hey, you said you think about race all the time, what does that mean? And so I explained, and then I was like, what do you think? And this is a white person, like, tell me your story. So I'm actually very interested in white people's stories, because I think white people do have stories. And I think sometimes in some spaces, white people, when they share their stories, those stories are dismissed, or they're like, oh, you're privileged, and I'm not gonna hear you. And then what happens is I see other white people go, I'm not gonna share my story, because like, I don't wanna be dismissed that way, right? And I think that it's, you know, where are you from? Where's your family from? Like, and then kind of disrupting, like, I do come from a place too. I heard that there's this one study when white people refer to themselves and say European Americans, actually everyone feels more included versus like white being default. Another thing I look at is just think about a lot is like this term privileged. And I feel like there's this de facto privilege means white people with unmerited advantages. And underprivileged means people of color. And I just think that simplifies things too much. Because I mean, you've got an MBA, you're very privileged, right? And what does that mean? Like, do you actually, are we gonna take the time to know each other, or did you actually just go and say like, I'm this because I'm this? And how do we kind of get down to this, let's learn about each other's stories. And then there's also, I just think, who are we talking to? Who do we assume is in the room, and what comments do we make? And I think a lot of this has to do around political tolerance. So I know I'm in Bernie land right now, so right? And it's just really interesting. I mean, because in Seattle, this phenomenon, like people say things, and it's just like, well, what if there's someone who's conservative in this room? Like, does that mean that they're, and when I was at this conference recently where it was all about accepting difference and bridging divides, and then once we got to our breakout group of 10 people, the people at the table started saying, like, how do we choose someone who's electable? And like, how does the Democrat Party choose someone who's electable? And I pointed out, I mean, I feel like we've started right away galvanizing left against right, or like blue against red, right? And like, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of this conversation? And so then how often are we actually being complicit in that, and just like in creating that silence? So these are more, I guess, these are things I think about a lot, because when I was a historian, really interested in that in between. I'm really, just like, for me, it's like, how do we ask more questions than to tell answers? Because to tell answers means that there's like a right and there's a wrong. And I think that there are so many other stories in between. I mean, even just with when I asked, why did you laugh, right? There were 3 different interpretations, and I bet if we asked more, there'd be a lot more interpretations. And I think like hearing those interpretations is where richness comes in. So I think the last thing I'm gonna, just the work that I do is, I run this cross-sector collaboration fellowship. And it's about bringing together people from the private sector, government, and community-based organizations. And we do a lot of work around assumptions and what assumptions we have around with each other. Because usually when we talk about unconscious bias or assumptions, people think their head goes straight to race or gender, and things that we can see, right? Like things, kind of visible diversity. And I think that there's actually there are a lot of assumptions around where we work, too. Oh, you work in education. I'm going to tell something that's embarrassing, but this is true. This is an assumption I had. So I was having an informational phone call with this woman who wanted to move from working in education to working in tech. And then she sent me a LinkedIn profile, or a LinkedIn request, and just saying like, hey, Julie, I did get that job at a tech company. And when I got it, I was like, oh, she's so pretty. I was like, Julie, what's your assumption, right? You know, and there it was, right? And then for me, it's more of like, why did I think that? Like, that's really interesting that I had that assumption. That was the first thing. And so I think like if we kind of look at our, kind of recognize that there are assumptions at all different levels, and how do we use that as a starting point to have conversations, and also to kind of reflect on our own lived experiences, then it feels less scary, right? Because when we talk about things that, like racism, it can feel really scary because people are afraid of saying that wrong thing. And it's just like, well then if we're so scared, then there's silence. And then and how do we move forward if there's silence? Right, and so there are just like these ways of when people don't get to tell their story, and then other people, and it's like, I'm helping you, this kind of good intention, this savior mentality, I'm helping you by painting you as the victim, and it's like, but that's not how I see myself, and I want to tell my story. So
I just want to add to that, beyond the savior complex, eventually what happened for me and for other white folks in doing this work is understanding the cost of racism to white people. Not to say that it is the same in any way, but that it is dehumanizing to me as well. And it was only until I could understand that I could sort of step away from the savior model. And so that's part of what I want to do, is to help other white people see the ways that racism has fractured them as well. The other piece of this is in curriculum, when I'm working with schools, is we talk about oppression and exception. So we're only ever talking about race in connection to oppression or somebody who beat the odds. And so I work with a lot of schools to sort of complicate that narrative and to talk about, as soon as there was oppression, there was resistance. People have never not resisted oppression. And also to include white people in that the only time we ever talk about whiteness is in connection to oppression as well. And there have not been enough, and not nearly enough, but there have always been white people also standing in solidarity. And where do those people live in our curriculum? How do we offer a different path forward to think about being white, instead of like, oh, if I talk about white, that means I'm part of the KKK. There has to be some other stories about what it can mean to be white and what is, so both and. So offering, there can be books where there are black children going to the store and it's not about some horrendous event that took place. And we also need stories of white people who are stepping in and not oppressing.
Thank you. We are pretty close to 5 o'clock here. We did get started a little bit late, but anybody who has to leave at 5 and is compelled to do that, we're not judging. Nobody's judging. But I did want to give a second for people who have questions that they would like to have answered, to pass them to the center, and we'll field a few of those. If you guys are up for it. And in the meantime, does anybody just want to raise their hand and ask a question?
We have cards. Let's honor the cards.
Yeah, great. from people. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please, yeah.
Because my question was on one that you all actually addressed about that binary of good versus bad. Like, if I'm a good white person, then I can't also be racist. And if someone challenges something I've done, then that makes me bad. And I was just actually really curious if you could speak more about how you've worked with that in your work and helping sort of either, any of you, about helping people kind of get out of that binary, because I just see that as being like one of, the biggest obstacles to us making any kind of progress with this is but I'm a good person syndrome.
I mean, I think it's about, I find that sometimes in this, white people tell very generic stories because they're afraid of sharing and taking risk. And so I think that I'm really interested in how do we get to a place where we can actually share stories that are risky and that other people may, and how do we feel, yes, other people might perceive me this way and I'm still gonna share it. And that we're all taking risk, and that we're all then sharing the labor of learning from one another. So that's all.
I think this is a super complex question, but a big part of it is changing the narrative and changing the conversation. And I feel like activists are trying to push this. We're trying to look at systemic, institutional, instead of talking about individual deeds. I mean, if you look at the press and what gets covered in terms of race, it's individual acts, right? We aren't talking about the ways healthcare have disproportionately served certain populations or education, right? We're still talking about this individual drew a swastika on a barn, and that's important, and we need to know about that. And it's also, it can't be the only conversation we have about injustice.
Can a person of color be racist against a white person?
Do you want that? I don't want that. I don't want that.
All right. I'm still thinking about this question. I've been thinking about it for years. So I just did an exploration, read a couple of books about the Black elite and how basically the Black elite created this pipeline from like preschool to adulthood to death, ultimately, of staying within the upper echelons. I was like really upset and angry as I was reading it, but also thinking about, there's one way you could look at it and say it's because of the bigger structures of racism that cause this specific group of people to create a system that duplicates and replicates this structure. Or you could say that this is also, or another way to look at it is say, actually, yeah, if you're thinking about could blacks be racist, some people will say they can't be racist because it assumes that Black Americans are automatically at the bottom of the pile in terms of power, when you look at the definition of racism and power. However, when I think about groups like Black elites or any other individuals, I still have a struggle. I personally cannot I'm not gonna say it's not true, a Black person cannot be racist. I've had debates with friends about this. It's a question that I don't really, because again, I'm still like, I'm not sure about that, how I think about that. Also, the complexity runs in terms of if someone, let's say, is multiracial, and depending on how they view their identity, how are they raised? There's so many different things and different layers to that I'm not sure that has a simple answer. But that's a really good question. I'm not sure where I stand on that.
I'm glad you brought up power, because I think that was the part of racism that I was struggling with. And so if we were to remove that, because I think that can be very kind of academic, and we were just to say, hey, racism is, I have these ideas about you, and I don't, based on your race, and even though I don't know you, then yes, I think racism can exist all around. And I think that there are also POC who can be racist against other POC. So, you know, it's not just like a POC white thing too. So, I mean, there's a lot of that even for, I think, between the Black and Asian community. So, yeah.
The definition I use is that the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of those require institutional power to be able to enact prejudice. And so in that definition, which is somewhat academic, but for my purposes and the way I'm using it out in the world, I think it's important that people of color can be prejudiced, they can be bigoted, they can be mean, in the same way that I can be mean and aggressive or whatever towards men, and yet I don't have the institutional and systemic power to systematically oppress men as a woman. And I don't believe that, though there is individual power in terms of systemic institutional representation, that folks of color have the ability to impact white people as an entire group. So.
Okay, the next question is, why should we care about whiteness when you're othered?
You want me to go? I don't know about individual care about whiteness. I think it's important to shine a light on whiteness because that is the baseline from which people are othered. So if we don't know it exists in terms of race, that whiteness is sort of a belief system, not just a skin color, that's the baseline from which everything else is considered other, right? We talk about authors of color. We don't mention an author's race unless they are a person of color, right? We talk about how does their racial or ethnic identity impact their writing. We aren't asking that question about white people often in classrooms, right? So it's like, until we can see it and name it and acknowledge that it has an impact, then it's gonna continue to cause everything else to be other, in my opinion.
So I feel whiteness is, the way we're using it is pretty academic, and so I'm gonna go back to just white people stories. That's how I'm gonna describe that, because I can't really speak from an academic perspective. And so I just think I wanna understand where other people, regardless of their race, what their stories are, because I think that's the only way we start to belong to one another and to build community. And you brought up community, right? And community takes work, and it's hard to build, and it means giving of myself too, and then also listening to other people. It's actually has to be actively built. So that's fine.
So I actually like to look for gaps. And so if I see something that's a wall of white, like the joke, I always make the joke about the Dead White Man Society in terms of poetry, right? Even though I like reading out of some of Dead White Man Society. And at the same time, what I like to do is look at where the missing gaps. I personally am no one's other. I'm not going to be anyone's other, nor am, are the gaps that I'm finding and filling in, are they others either? So what I try to look at is, how is that just a part of, Toni Morrison in my mind is not a Black author. She's an author. She's an American author, right? So I like to try to combat and think about it in the landscape and say, in the future, it'd be great to see a bookstore where, women's history or, gender studies isn't just this scary, this little narrow column, and then you go and you see Black history and it's got a shelf, and then they've moved on to something else. It would be great to actually see it embedded, because it's just a part of, the whole landscape. Or Moonlight. When I went to go see Moonlight a few years ago, to me, it was an American Boy story. Like, I was afraid that, I thought they did a beautiful job, especially with the score and how the score matched the imagery. But I wanted to think about, how is this just a part of the tapestry of American story? How can we just have that just be a part of that? And so, the more we can try to do that, I think the better, even though on a human level, I think we'll find something else to try, whether it's the color of our eyes or height, or we were talking about body type before the panel. I think we'll try to find something maybe, but it would be great to try to get away from, how do we just say this is just a part of the tapestry of what is?
Okay. It's kind of a tough one. Is it enough to just treat people of color as other people, or is there a special way to treat them instead?
Okay. Yeah, I think so much is about context, and context is constantly changing, and how we feel about something is constantly changing. So I'll give an example of, I have Asian American friends who sometimes get really offended when they hear the question, "Where are you from?" Right? Like, "Where are you from?" And then so there are days where it's like, "Oh, when hearing 'Where are you from?" then it feels like, "Are you assuming that I'm not from here? Are you othering me?" Right? And so, and then it's like, oh, then, and if a white person asks an Asian person, "Hey, where are you from?" and then that person says, like, "Why are you asking me? I'm from here. You're making me feel othered." And then that white person will never ask that question again, right? And then maybe, and when I get asked that question, because I've lived abroad, I'll say, I know, I was born in Vietnam, and now I grew up in Seattle, right? And and it's gonna differ from each person. So I think you can't say all people of color are gonna feel this way about that question, right? And because sometimes it's actually kind of annoying when it's like, I know what you're asking, but you won't ask, right? Because you're trying to be polite, right? And so, are you just gonna ask? Because it's okay. I want you to take that risk, and I think that building relationships take risk, and people of color aren't monolithic. We can't, so, yeah, it's gonna be different.
I like that question. So I'm going to riff off of the "Where are you from" is a good example, because in Vermont, there are certain parts of Vermont where that's touchy for certain groups of people, and I like it as an opportunity, even though people have, I've had African cab drivers ask me, "Where am I from?" Because they're like, "Are you really from this country, or were you born somewhere in Africa?" They're trying to see if I was, maybe coming from the same place they were. I've had Jamaicans ask me, "Are you sure you're not from Jamaica?" And so from an early age, I got trained into saying, "Oh, well, I'm thinking this is a conversation." So then I can say, "Well, where are you from? Where did you grow up? What is your story?" I'm not going to assume what you're thinking, and maybe you're just sorting and saying, "Well, she looks like," so I'm going to say, "Well, are you from here?" "No, I'm not. Where are you from? Let's have this conversation." I also think about things like affirmative action and reparations, right? So I think about affirmative action. For me, again, it's just I want to see a moment where people of color are invited to the table because they are the right fit and because they have all the credentials, not because it's affirmative action, we're giving a leg up and we're making amends for something really jacked up we did. And I'm not saying it's not needed, but I'm saying I would like to see, it would be great to put systems in place or deconstruct the system so that there's a more level playing field for a lot of different people, especially when we think about class and certain places where people come from. But also in the conversation about reparations too, and thinking about special treatment, I'm not gonna turn out a check. I'm not gonna turn out a check and give me back some land, that'd be great. But at the same time, I keep asking the question of how is that going to undo the damage The sheer damage when I think about, for example, Black women being 4 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth in 2018, 2019, 2020. We're still doing that. And so not so much, no, not special treatment, but how do you step back and say, how should people be living? How should we make living sustainable for everyone? This is the United States of America and land of the free, but how do you make that true for everybody? Because I'm very curious about, how do you make it true for people in trailer parks? How do you make it true for people coming from all these different walks of life, or people coming from different countries, they come here? How are you making that available for everybody? So no, don't do me any favors, and do not treat me special. Treat me special because I have the credentials to be sitting at your table. And if you don't, I'm going to make sure you should be treating me special based on those things, not based on the color of my skin.
Okay, just 2 more questions. When and how do you forgive ignorance? These are good.
Okay, so this is another one where I don't believe in forgiveness, really. I just personally, again, spent years thinking about it. I believe in indifference. I believe in thinking about calculating how much time I need to put into something, because time, to me, you can choose where you're putting your attention to. And so in those ways, rather than thinking about forgiving ignorance, I think about it in terms of how much time do I need to put into having a further conversation with this person. If I don't need to do that, then I'd like to take my time back and myself back and my energy back, and I'll walk away from the table. Not rudely, but in some cases, some people will never know. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So there was an incident where someone wrote me. I wrote a piece, and I was very, not afraid, but I was questioning whether or not I should just call out the person or the offender or the group within the piece that I wrote. It was a public piece, and someone wrote me and they said, so I just want to know who you're talking about in this piece. And I said, that's not the important part. The important part is, given the lens, we should be thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the optics were just not right. That was the main point of it. And then this person wrote back and said, okay, that's the good news. Bad news is that didn't come across in your piece. I'm a professional editor. I could help you write your piece. I said, 1, I don't need your help. 2, my husband has worked for Newsweek and back in the day. And so I have a live-in editor, in addition to the fact that way before him, I've been writing, and I'm a professional writer too. So what's good? I didn't say the what's good part. Would like to put. So I've had these conversations sometimes where people either ask, they're offended because I wasn't smiling. And so I have to school, I'm like, oh my God, I'm explaining myself. And so I'll engage in conversations, but again, there are times when, or there was a time when I called someone out on racism, and they'd mentioned that their godparents knew Coretta Scott King. And I was like, yo, they threw in, they threw in Coretta Scott King, so I guess that's the end of the conversation. I bless you, you're not racist. What is that? So I, again, have to think about, it's whether how many emails I'm exchanging with people, or moments where I have to say, okay, we have to stop this conversation now, thanks. And that's how I've chosen to deal with it, which is probably, not the nicest way, but it's better than just, going straight ham, which I've been tempted to, but I'm like, you know what, I don't have time for this, so that's how I deal.
Yeah, so 2 things pop to mind. So one is, there are many times I've been ignorant, so I think I'm probably more on that forgiving end because people have shared with me and called me in, and I appreciate that. I feel like it's a cycle, right? And then the other time is when it's just, whoa, you, now I have an example. I was like, where's an example? Okay, an example. I was at a conference, and this older white man, when he found out I was Vietnamese, he said, "Oh, it's just so horrible, all of the things that we did to your country." And I said, "Oh, well, you know, my father actually fought for the South Vietnamese military, and so we were fighting for democracy." And so just kind of subtly educating him, and so that started this conversation, right? Because I could understand, like, he just didn't know, and so it was just and the thing is, like, a lot of people don't know. So, I mean, that's all I got.
All right, this last question. So what advice would you give to someone scared of engaging in a conversation about race, and what are the ways to start that conversation?
Okay.
You're like, own it.
Yeah. I would say there are a lot of really amazing books out there. That's a great place to start. I think it can be super useful to have white anti-racist affinity space, or attempting to be anti-racist affinity space, but white space with the intention of talking about whiteness and practicing and trying to get better. Because I talk about racial literacy. It's a form of literacy. It's a skill. It's something that can be developed. It's not like you are a good person or a bad person. It's that maybe you haven't had to have these conversations in your life, and now you want to. So there requires a certain amount of self-study and self-educating, and doing that in partnership, collaboration is super useful, I think. But it is a skill that can be developed and should be developed, in my opinion.
I do think it's hard to, for me, hard to learn on my own. I mean, there are lots of things I can read, but I actually learn the best when then I have conversations with people. And so I usually just start with, because talking about race is super vulnerable and it can be scary, and so I start with a story of talking about just how I've learned through the process. I'll give an example. About 5 years ago, I had a conversation. It was during the Black Lives Matters movement, and I could not understand. I was like, what is Black Lives Matter, and why don't they say all lives matter? And so I asked a African American friend what this means, and I was like, I don't understand. And so he then explained it to me, and he was like, hey, it's not that they're not saying all lives don't matter. It's more because Black lives historically haven't mattered. I was like, oh, thank you. And I actually learned a lot more than I think I could have learned through reading some text, right? And it also then, because I took that risk, we started talking, having much deeper conversations. And yeah, I mean, I had to take a risk, so.
Speaking of taking risk, I have friends who, they're not even Black American. One friend in particular is African, like literally African American and African, from Africa, and will provide these really interesting, really different insights when it comes to race. Even borderline could be offensive, but I appreciate the fact that he just goes there and just says it. And so now this, please don't leave here and do this, because at least for me, I'm an un-PC person, if you haven't picked up on that. And so I wish it was better, like, not walk on eggshells. Sometimes you're gonna bump into things. It's going to be clumsy. It is going to be messy. Also sign up for the fact that it is gonna be very uncomfortable. No one can cushion these conversations. Also, I'm thinking of a recent conversation that Mac and I had, or it was an interview. We talked with Stefan Gillum, the president of the Windham County NAACP, and he was talking about like doing self-assessment, right? So maybe before even diving into conversation, start with the self-assessment of all, I think a self-assessment that we all need to be asking ourselves, but specifically, how did I grow up? What are some of my belief systems? What are some of the stories I'm telling myself or was taught to tell myself, or especially as it relates to race, how was I taught to think about race? I certainly, I was like recalling so many things from my childhood around interracial relationships and how it was something I wasn't really encouraged to be in an interracial relationship at all, but like there were interracial couples who'd come to the house. I mean, all these different things, an interesting landscape to kind of reverse engineer and think about, well, where did all this come from? So starting with that, but also I think the more that we can, if we're going to use the word forgiving, like create forgiving spaces, but also it doesn't have to be so charged. Like I like Do the Right Thing. The Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Like, how do you engage in culture and things? And it doesn't necessarily always live in a book. I mean, books are helpful, but they'll take you so far. But I think also culture, whether it's music, whether it's movies, just trying to actually, if you want to have a conversation about race, I used to talk to parents about sexuality and how to talk to their kids about sexuality, and there's something called teachable moments. And sometimes a movie, the way, like a movie night, or how can you just use something like that that takes the heat off of you yourself bringing it up, but just maybe that's what you're talking about and you back into it, so.
Yeah, I just want to add quickly that I mean to say that white affinity space is in addition to, not instead of, cross-racial dialogue, that for people who are truly paralyzed to talk about it at all, white affinity space can be a good place to start. And then for many white people, I think of it as sort of remediation, like many of us grew up without the language and are terrified, so just want to add that.
This question, right? How do you as a white person continuously call yourself out, or do you? And this is kind of three questions, sorry. But for white people taking on the role of dismantling racism in education, it's important, but it's risky. And how do you navigate the impression of being a white savior, do the work, and claim authority in an ethical way? It's another Patty.
Okay, I'm going to do my best here. How do I call myself out regularly, or do I? I will say that certainly there's always a healthy dose of self-analysis. I've laid awake many nights thinking, how could I have said that? What did I just say? Rethinking. But that is obviously not enough, particularly because this is the work I engage in on a daily basis. So I have accountability partners. I have a group of white folks that I check in with regularly, who I can call at a moment's notice to work through something if I need to work through it before I speak to folks of color. I also have accountability partners who are folks of color. So depending on what the situation is, I go to other people who I know aren't going to affirm and say, oh, you didn't mean that, they're just overreacting. I have people who say, oh, I've done that too, let's work on this, let's figure it out, what's a way forward? I try to make repair. I work in collaboration and community is my quick response to that. The white savior thing is I could spend hours on that. And the truth is, it's a stage of white racial identity development, is to, once you start to see that the world and the experience of everyone isn't the same, then this idea of privilege and wanting to help people with less privilege, that's where, and I full on head first went out trying to save people and offer my privilege in whatever way I could come up with. And that is a stage that I had to go through, and it fell on folks of color to sort of reflect back to me that that's what I was doing in order to move out of it. And so part of my goal in the work I do is to have other white people to say, hey, I think you're doing that savior thing, so that it's not causing more harm, and yet it is sort of a necessary stage to get past it, to go through it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
How can you create an awareness of issues without reinforcing a stereotype of victimization for those who have been traditionally affected? You want it?
Sure. I feel like, okay, can you repeat the question?
Okay, so how can you create an awareness of issues surrounding race without reinforcing a stereotype of victimization for those who have been traditionally affected?
So, okay, so I'm not an activist. I've done that kind of work when I was younger, but even then, I was training other people to hit the street, and that's not I've actually finally have become comfortable in saying that's not my form of how I want to use my voice. I'm more interested in using my voice through writing, and through creating art and doing other things, or leveraging my platform. Not that the example I'm about to give, they don't need me to give them a platform. So when I think wherever possible, so for example, I pitched a piece to a national outfit to write about Women's History Month, but in a way to recognize some of the voices that we've either forgotten about or that you normally don't hear about. You know, a woman named Henrietta Wood, who sued her kidnappers. She got re-enslaved and she sued them and she won. You know, or women who worked out of Storyville, they were madams. I like to think in my head they'd be my friends if they were alive now. And, you know, women who leveraged their mixed heritage, even if it really didn't exist, in order for them to make money and feed themselves. Because during that time in the country, but certainly true in New Orleans, they weren't, their choice was to clean houses, clean toilets. They chose to kind of rebrand themselves before that was even a term, and they made money. And judge what you want about their line of business, but they were entrepreneurs, and they employed others as well. So I thought about, I was like, yeah, you know what, if they take this piece, this is how I'm going to use this and write about these voices and some of these other stories and really step back, at least the more I think about history. How do we reframe the conversation? And so even in my research right now of reaching out to scholars, reaching out to poets, I talked with Terrence Hayes a couple of weeks ago, and then I talked to Professor Fred Dubois about their body of work and how they're using their writing to recapture memory that might have been lost, stolen, forgotten, as it specifically relates to African American diaspora. Certainly, as I've shared what I was doing with other people, some of them will say, well, I hope you don't stay that narrow because it applies to everybody. And I said, yeah, but honestly, there are groups of people who get erased or forgotten, and I have this opportunity and I'm going to use it. And so this is where I think I'd like to use it. But also in thinking about things like Afrofuturism, which I'm not versed in that at all. But I find it so fascinating, that there's a whole group of people thinking about what does 2250 look like, and how does that engage with the conversation we're having now about race, or how do we move beyond that? How do you get beyond that shell? Or even the poet I just mentioned that I talked to. If you read Terrence Hayes' work, he does a lot with trying to break beyond that bounds, and then sometimes writing within that identity and breaking out of that identity. And certainly in the work that I've co-curated with the Vermont Arts Council for the I Am exhibition, thinking about what does that mean? Like, how do you write within identity, but also how do you try to shed identity? And what does thinking forward look like, or what does it mean when you're thinking about then, now, and future being all the same thing? And so I like to say I do it from my platform as I want to strive to be a public intellectual. So, or as many ways as I can do that. That's how I use my platform to voice out of that, and also through my work about Lucy Terry Prince as well.
I think a lot about it in terms of this binary that's often present in narratives, that and a bit of that carries this savior mentality too. This group needs to be saved. Even sometimes we use these euphemisms, underserved, right? Black, right? Like black and brown communities. That's what, and how people are supposed to understand that. So I'm going to give 2 examples, one professional, one personal. So, like I said, I run this fellowship that brings together people from different sectors. And one of the cohorts specialized, we focused on this, the theme was on belonging. What does it mean to belong to a community? And there were 3 teams, and they each looked at 3 different neighborhoods. And I had to keep reminding them, your job is not to go in there and solve the problems, right? They've got good stuff happening, right? And what was great was like when they went in, they're like, wow, people keep talking about have and have-nots and all this, and how do we help people, but actually there's a lot of really good stuff happening. And how do we celebrate those stories? How do we share the stories of what they are, how they're living their lives? And so I think that's about surfacing the issues through the voices of the people who live in the community, and not just, oh, how do we help you? Which is also kind of this ego thing of like, and I'm really good at solving other people's problems, right? Another one, personal example, is just the term refugee. And so I think some people will think of refugees as victims. And I don't think of myself as a victim. I think of myself as actually super lucky and super privileged that I came here, and as a young child, I was granted legal status. And I think about my friends who are DACA recipients, or whose parents also brought them here from Mexico undocumented. And both our parents, like, we didn't know what our parents were doing, and yet, because of our different status, I get to become a citizen. And I think of my community as being, of the refugee community as being super resilient. And when I was an undergrad, my thesis was about the South Vietnamese military perspective of the Vietnam War. So when, in a lot of American historiography and media, you see the Vietnam War as being portrayed between the Vietnamese and the Americans. And the Vietnamese are actually the de facto the communists, the North Vietnamese. And they don't really talk about the South Vietnamese. And the South Vietnamese were allies to the Americans. Americans weren't fighting for South Vietnam, they were fighting with South Vietnam. And that has become just kind of out, it's not part of the narrative here. And it's so interesting to me when people, when people see me as a Vietnamese refugee, it's like, oh yes, we Americans, we gave you this chance to have a better life because of what we did for your country. And I think that undermines the fact that we escaped something. South Vietnamese escaped a communist regime. It wasn't just to get a better life, it was to actually escape a communist regime. And there's this one, can't remember her name, she's a Somali British poet who wrote this poem, Refugee. And there's this line in there, something, because no one would put their child on open water unless the land was safer, or unless the land was more dangerous than the water, right? And so there are just like these ways of when people don't get to tell their story, and then other people, and it's like, I'm helping you with this kind of good intention, this savior mentality, I'm helping you by painting you as the victim, and it's like, but that's not how I see myself, and I want to tell my story. So.
I just want to add to that, beyond the savior complex, eventually what happened for me and for other white folks in doing this work is understanding the cost of racism for white people. Not to say that it is the same in any way, but that it is dehumanizing to me as well. And it was only until I could understand that I could sort of step away from the savior model. And so that's part of what I want to do, is to help other white people see the ways that racism has fractured them as well. The other piece of this is in curriculum, when I'm working with schools, is we talk about oppression and exception exception. So we're only ever talking about race in connection to oppression or somebody who beat the odds. And so I work with a lot of schools to sort of complicate that narrative and to talk about as soon as there was oppression, there was resistance. People have never not resisted oppression. And also to include white people in that, that the only time we ever talk about whiteness is in connection to oppression as well. And there have not been enough and not nearly enough, but there have always been white people also standing in solidarity. And where do those people live in our curriculum? How do we offer a different path forward to think about being white instead of like, oh, if I talk about white, that means I'm part of the KKK. There has to be some other stories about what it can mean to be white and what is. So both and. So offering, there can be books where there are black children going to the store and it's not about some horrendous event that took place. And we also need stories of white people who are stepping in